Hi, and welcome back to Unit 2 of your Studies in World Literature course on the global city. I just want to briefly talk through some of my thoughts on this unit and what sort of thematic issues I think I want us to be addressing. And then I'll very briefly talk about some of the assignments and assessments for this week and my thoughts on that. Obviously, in Unit 2, we're moving away from focusing on New York and starting to think about cities of the global south, and specifically thinking about Johannesburg, Dhaka in Bangladesh, and Mexico City. I want to emphasize that it's not that these are necessarily a different type of city than New York. But rather that they are part of a combined and uneven system of world cities, that world cities constitute a sort of network, but wealth and power is unevenly distributed across that system. And the condition of these cities and the sort of social and cultural shape of these cities is determined by the same processes as those at work in New York, but the effects are obviously very different. These are cities that are defined by extreme inequality of income, and this inequality is often embedded in the topography of the city and in its everyday spaces. I mean, it's defined also by processes like migration and relationships with more powerful cities like New York. Also, it's interesting to think about the effect of migration on cities of the global south, because it's quite different to the way that it operates within a city like New York. If you look at, for example, Johannesburg, you have huge net inward migration from the hinterlands of Johannesburg, and from rural areas of South Africa and further north into Africa. But you also have net emigration and a sort of projection of the identity of Johannesburg into other cities. You see this in a more pronounced way in Mexico City, where obviously it's taking in huge numbers from its hinterland, but it also has a sort of dispersed identity because so many people are also emigrating from this area into places like Los Angeles or into the United States more generally. So there are similar processes at work here, but they obviously operate very differently, and they have a very different effect on the space and the culture and the social life of those cities. And that obviously gives rise to a very different type of novel as well. These are novels that we're looking at that are conscious, first of all, of the links between localized poverty and global economic and cultural systems. That the things that we encounter and the things that we see in these novels are always very sort of consciously linked with broader globalized economic processes, and you can see how the writers draw those links. They're also novels that attend to tensions between, on the one hand, sort of hyper modernity. These are not sort of okay. So step back a second, and I want to call into question a vocabulary that is often used in relation to the global south and cities of the global south, which is that of delayed development or underdevelopment. There's a tendency to think of places like Africa and certain parts of Asia as being less developed or playing catch up with the more developed world. What many economic theorists tend to say is that these are places that are part of a system of combined and uneven development instead. And so it's not that they're lagging behind and playing catch up, but rather that their poverty and their inequality and their marginalization is a function of their being part of that modern world system. So that modernity itself is in part creating the sort of conditions of poverty that to some extent define life in these cities. So these are novels that attend to a tension between that hyper-modernity, that sort of experience of a hyper-modern globalized world, and abiding local cultural formations, local cultural beliefs, local cultural conditions, and also attend to the sort of inequality and the tensions that exist between all of these sort of different forces. So what we tend to see in these novels is a lot of clashes of tone. So all three of the novels that we're looking at are in part kind of treated as realist novels. You could see this as being quite realistic in its depiction of Johannesburg, say, or Dhaka. But then on the other hand, they tend to have quite fantastical elements that are very incongruous with that realism. And there's a sort of tonal or stylistic tension at the heart of all of these novels. And it can be quite jarring to read that sort of incongruous way of presenting this city. And it's very much at odds with the style of the New York novels we've been looking at, which are broadly real in the sense that, well, it sounds like something that could really happen. Whereas we don't really think that people who are guilty of some terrible act will end up having to carry an animal around for the rest of their lives. It introduces these sort of very fantastical elements into the novel in order to convey ideas or experiences that are themselves quite incongruous and sort of that speak to the difficulty of articulating modern experience in the global South. So that novels of the global South tend to draw upon quite fantastical or unrealistic elements, or are forced to resort to that kind of fantastical stuff in order to convey the sheer weirdness and incongruity of modern life in a global city in the world South. So, for example, in something like Zoo City, Lauren Bukes draws upon kind of shamanistic notions of spirit animals and so on for its central concept. And obviously that isn't in keeping with our idea of a novel about a modern city like Johannesburg. But when she draws upon that sort of those sort of ideas, sort of vaguely shamanistic ideas, she does so in a way that's quite science fiction like in its tone, and it's presented very literally. I mean, we take this as literally true, that this woman is carrying a sloth around on her back everywhere she goes, but she's also quite clearly using this concept of being animaled as a way to explore questions of inequality, exclusion, marginalization along lines of race, gender, and income. So racial exclusion, gender exclusion, and especially sort of income inequality and marginalization. These sort of themes are being worked through this very weird concept of being animals, and it's worth thinking about what sort of role this very fantastical concept has in an otherwise quite realistic or ostensibly realistic novel. And it does have very realistic purposes, I think. It's trying to explore the social complexity of that cityscape and its topographical inequalities and all of that, but it's doing so through this really weird central concept that takes a little bit of getting used to. But I think what I want us to do is lean into that incongruity, that weirdness, and think about, well, why do these authors feel compelled to use these sort of weird concepts to achieve what they want to say about cities like Johannesburg? Similarly, we can see this. We can see in that novel a lot of elements of not just science fiction, but also also magical realism. I mean, the idea of animals, of being animaled, is quite magical realist, I think is the best term for this. It's the idea that you're using magical elements to convey realistic thematic issues, right? But she also uses the form of a kind of detective noir novel, and that is the ultimate city genre. It's very typical of um, of of urban writing, and it's very typical of detective novels to be also about exploring and coming to understand the complexity of the modern city. Raymond Chandler novels are more or less the novel of the sort of mid 20th century city, and in some ways Bukes is drawing upon that as well. In Gin City, we can also see a sort of satire of extreme wealth and extreme inequality that similarly, like with Zoo City, draws on existing cultural coordinates within Dhaka, concepts of genies and that sort of magical, let's say, again, a magical realist kind of culture in order to explore themes that are very relevant to the modern moment and the experience of globalization. So it's drawing attention to a sort of jarring incongruity, the sort of coincidence of the modern and the pre-modern within Dhaka. Vlad is also very much attuned to the historical cityscape of Mexico City and its development, its economic imbrication into a global system. But in Vlad, Carlos Fuentes draws very specifically upon a European story, Dracula and vampires and so on. So rather than drawing upon, let's say, traditional Mexican culture or something like that, he basically transplants the Irish story of Dracula to modern Mexico City. Vampires have a long association with critique of capitalism. It's often capitalism is often described as vampiric, as being as blood sucking, as a kind of that vampires exploit their victims in a way that is useful for sort of stories of capitalism, and Fuentes is clearly very conscious of that. But he's telling a story about global capitalism and drawing and so the arrival of this European figure, Count Dracula, who's at once aristocratic but also capitalistic, that he sort of arrives into modern Mexico City as a sort of embodiment of extreme exploitation. And the what it has in common with the other novels in this unit is the tendency to draw upon magical or unrealistic elements to make a point about economic things like economic development, economic inequality. But what it shares also with those novels is a focus on the space of the city. It's very conscious of the historical topography of Mexico City and the sort of contradictions at work within that place, and again the inequality that's at work within it. So there's a good sense of thematic coherence to these novels. I am conscious, though, that that's a lot of novels to cover, and one of the things that came up in the survey, the survey's not finished yet, so I don't want to comment entirely on it, but a couple of people have commented that maybe the reading is a little bit heavy in this unit, and I think you might be right. I think we may have overpacked this one, but that's why I've, for one thing, made sure that last week you didn't have any new reading, and also that this week you can choose one or other of Gin City or Zoo City to use as a sort of jumping off point to begin exploring the kind of thematic issues that we're going to be working through in Unit 2. Now, what we've been looking at in Unit 1, and what you did a magnificent job of looking at, things like the flaneur, and those sort of concepts in the global city and all of that, that's all still perfectly relevant to the global south. I mean, why would it not be? Of course it is. But we want to start to also think about, well, what sort of things are specific to cities of the global south that are maybe giving rise to this very different type of novel, this very differently shaped novel. And that's why I've asked you to read those essays and work together towards an understanding of what they have to say, and what they might help us to understand about the novel of the global south. But you can, when we're focusing on those essays, you can draw upon whichever of those novels you want this week, and then next week you can look at the other one. So hopefully the reading load won't get too overwhelming as a result. That's my hope. Okay. The structure of it is a little looser. You're also going to be a little bit more independent at this point in terms of what kind of ways you're going to explore these novels and how you're going to think about them. We won't have as much in the way of group task stuff. It's going to be more like discussion forum based, like we'll do another discussion forum next week. Part of that, though, is, again, the survey results are showing that the group work maybe isn't working quite as well for people as other aspects of the course are. There's a clear pattern where people are less fond of the group work than they are of some of the other stuff. So that indicates a need for some adjustment in terms of how we do that. It's a difficult thing because we're in an online course and you want a sense of community. And I'm so used to being able to go into a class and we can talk about a book and see what we think about it. It's very hard to replicate that sense of community online. So the group work was an attempt to do that. It's not working. So we'll figure a different way of doing that. This week also, you're going to be carrying out your workshop. Some of you have been doing that already, workshopping the paper that we did last week. My sense is that I might adjust when I start grading that stuff, because I gave you grades for that yesterday. I think that if the workshop is beneficial, and again, I think it can be beneficial, but we'll see. I'd be interested to know what you think of that. I might actually ask you to get in touch about what you think worked or didn't work about the workshop. But one way or the other, I think I might hold off on grading future short papers that we're doing, these sort of minor assignments. I might not grade them until you've had a chance to workshop them together and revise them, and then submit them after you've had a chance to work together. So that there's a bit more of a sense of like, okay, there's benefit to be gotten out of this, and my grade can be enhanced by that kind of work. Of course, it can still be enhanced by that kind of work because you can always revise and resubmit that work. But I'm thinking we might change that. But in the meantime, I've rambled on a little bit here, so I'll cut this off now. But I did want to reiterate what I said in my announcement yesterday. Those essays were fantastic. You're doing really, really good work on this. I'm very proud of what you've done. And you're showing serious progress already. I can see how ideas have built from the early assignments up until that argument, and it bodes really well for the kind of work we're going to do in these following units, which for me, unit 1 is great. I really like those novels. But it's in unit 2 where we really break out and start thinking about this as, first of all, as world literature, but also start thinking about more exciting aspects of how world literature functions within a world system. So I'm really looking forward to doing all that. I will be traveling again next week, so there may be some little delays in terms of getting grades back to you and stuff like that. But I will try and stay on top of it as best I can. Thanks so much. Keep up the good work. Thank you.